Hello, everyone. I think that we're ready to start our third event of the one-day symposium. My name is Chloé Kaczmarek. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Roman Studies at Duke University, and I'll be facilitating the conversation for the next 2.5 hours or so. I'd like to give you some quick technical notice before sharing a few introductory remarks and then handing it over to the panelists. So for the next 2 hours and approximately 45 minutes, we'll be discussing masks and thinking images. For about 1.5 hours, we'll listen to the panelists, and we will then have a bit more than an hour, hopefully, if we don't run too late, for questions and answers, starting with the panelists themselves before opening the floor to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question to the speakers, as demonstrated by the previous talks, you'd need to use the question and answer tool that should be at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. And I encourage you to submit your questions as they come. I hope we have the time to address as many as possible. One of the speakers, Professor Raymond Bellour, will be giving his talk in French. Instantaneous translation will be available thanks to Nicola Elliot. At the beginning of Professor Bellour's talk, you'll be asked to choose between the English or the French channel. A little interpretation tool will appear again at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you'd like to listen to Professor Bellour in French, no changes will need to be made. But if you'd like to switch to English, you'll need to activate it in the interpretation mode. Once Professor Bellour has finished, the stream will reset back to default. And again, you're welcome to submit your questions to the speakers either in French or in English. They'll be translated for the speakers and the audience by Nicola Elliot. So I think we're done with the housekeeping. So in this panel titled Masks and Thinking Images, the speakers will question the way in which masks appear in philosophical essays, in film, on the theater stage, and how they contribute both as objects and figures of discourse to a conversation about the ontology of images. Anne-Gaëlle Saliot will start us off with a presentation on the power of death masks in the post-Heideggerian thought. Professor Saliot is an associate professor in the Department of Roman Studies and of Cinematic Arts in the Department of Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke University. She's also the head of the Center for French and Francophone Studies at Duke. Her first book, published in 2015, entitled The Drowned Muse, The Unknown Woman of the Saints' Survivals from 19th Century Modernity to the Present, investigates the fascination in both the avant-garde and popular media for the inconnu de la scène. She's also published on Godard, Truffaut, and Rivette, and her most recent research focuses on the perception of Japan in French theory, cinema, theater, and dance in the second half of the 20th century. Professor Saliot's presentation will be followed by a talk by Raymond Bellour. It's difficult to introduce Raymond Bellour's work in a few words, but I'll try my best. Raymond Bellour is Director of Research Emeritus at the CNRS in France. He is a scholar and writer whose work has been devoted to both literature and film. He has, for instance, edited the complete works of Henri Michaud in the Pléiade collection and curated a number of exhibitions. In 1991, he has participated to the creation of the film journal Trafic with Serge Danet. And his books include, amongst others, L'analyse du film, L'entre-image 1 et 2, Le corps du cinéma, or La querelle des dispositifs. Today, he'll be giving a presentation on wax masks and Michael Curtis' 1933 film, Mystery of the Wax Museum. Vialle and Stéphanie Boulard will then go on to discuss the use of a singular mask in Pascal Quignard's performance play, The Riverbank and the Dark, which was created at the Festival d'Avignon. Vialle, the performer in the piece, is an actress who has performed on stage with several directors, including Didier Bezas, Luc Bondy, Alain Françon, Jean-François Sivadier, and David Lescaut. She's currently working on a new adaptation of Pascal Quignard's text, In This Garden We Loved. Stéphanie Boulard is an associate professor of French literature and visual arts at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Professor Boulard's research focuses on literary criticism and word and image relations from the 19th century to the contemporary period. Author of Rouge Hugo, she has also published extensively on the works in 20th and 21st century French writers, including, but not limited to, Hélène Cixous, Henri Michaud, Jean Genet, and of course, Pascal Quignard. And finally, the last presentation in this panel is going to be given by Erhard Stiefel and Claude Dessimond, and is titled Studying Masks from Artifacts, Focus on a Method in Development. It will take place in their studio laboratory. Erhard Stiefel is the creator of theater masks and the first master of art, maître d'art, in the field of performing arts appointed by the French Ministry of Culture in the year 2000. He has been making masks for national and international productions since 1968. I'd like to mention his long-lasting collaboration with Ariane Mnouchkine at the Théâtre du Soleil in Paris, as well as his work with director Alfredo Arias or with actor Tim Robbins. Claude Dessimond is a PhD student in the Department of Art, Aesthetics, Practices and Theory at the Université Polytechnique des Hauts-de-France, where his research focuses on Erhard Stiefel's studio and practice. He became assistant to Stiefel in 2009 and has since then conducted both practical and theoretical research on theater masks as a sculptor and as a scholar at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and at the Université Paris 8 Vincennes. I'd also like to introduce our translator, Nicolas Elliot. He is a writer as well as a translator, and some of his most recent translations include essays by William Marx and a collection of conversations between Marguerite Duras and Jean-Luc Godard. From 2009 to 2020, he was the American correspondent for French film magazine Les Cahiers du Cinéma, and his writing appeared as well in a number of film publications and journals in the US. And finally, I'd like to conclude this long introduction by thanking Pascal Beillard from the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in Atlanta, who worked tremendously behind the scenes to make this event possible, as well as Professors Saliot, Boulard, and Barsky for organizing this fascinating day of conversation and reflection. A big thanks as well to Maria Nero, who has patiently taken care of all the technical issues and anxieties for all of us speakers today. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Professor Saliot to take it away.
Thank you very much, Chloe, for your wonderful and quite long introduction, but it's a very populated panel. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly. In his essay, Une voix venue d'ailleurs, Voice from Elsewhere, from 1992, Maurice Blanchot approaches Louis-René Desforest's poetry through an allusion to the Inconnu de la Seine. The Inconnu de la Seine names the death mask of a girl who supposedly drowned herself in the Seine at the end of the 19th century. And you have a picture by Rudomin of the mask here. The image of the mask constitutes the incipit of Blanchot's commentary on Desforest-led collections of poems of Samuel Wood, from 1988. Composed 21 years after his young daughter's death, and which addresses the irreducible and untranslatable experience of suffering brought about by the death of a child. And I quote, you have the quotation just right here. When I was living in S, in the little room where I most often stayed, there still is, hanging on the wall, the likeness of the girl they called the unknown girl from the Seine, an adolescent with closed eyes, but alive, with such a fine, blissful, but veiled smile that one might have thought she had drawn in an instant of extreme happiness. Shot through with the image of the youthful girl who comes to haunt the dreams of her grieving father every night, Desforest's poems are endowed with a strong visuality. The images are nonetheless infused with a spectral quality. Every appearance seems to designate the trauma of disappearance, to point towards absence. Deployed here as a liminal figure to a poetic work centered around the haunting presence of an absent child, the figure of the mask provides an important repository, as well as a frame of reference for Blanchot's thinking of images on literature. Today, I would like to concentrate on the ways in which images of mask in general and of death mask in particular have entered into and triggered dialogues between the literary and philosophical imagination in post-Heideggerian thought through and around the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot. The philosophical lives of mask in the 20th and 21st centuries offer precious insight into the tenor of philosophical dialogues which proceed and have emerged in the wake of Heidegger. Mask surfaces in several philosophical essays preoccupied with ideology, such as Alain Badiou's Le siècle, the century, and with images on their relation to death, most remarkably in Maurice Blanchot's L'espace littéraire, translated as the space of literature, and Jean-Luc Nancy, Au fond des images, translated as the ground of the image, where it serves as a figural allusion to probe Heidegger's reading of Kant's concept of schema. An exploration of Blanchot's own conception of the image, as developed in the annex of the space of literature, provides fertile ground for analyzing Mask as both object of theory and figure of theoretical discourse. I intend to explore the analogy between death and the image traced by Blanchot in the space of literature and by Jean-Luc Nancy in the ground of the image. At the heart of the space of literature lies an interrogation of the image. In an illuminating note at the end of the first section's meditation on Rilke's essential solitude, literature is defined in its relation to the image. Literary language is apprehended something very specific, namely that the approach towards writing entails a displacement of the common vision of the image as a simple reflection of a pre-existing real object. The note ends with the question, what is an image? An entire section of the annex, the two versions of the imaginary, attempts to answer this question. According to Emmanuel Levinas, Blanchot's criticism on fictions displays Heideggerian ontology and encourage us to abandon it. Levinas' reasoning nevertheless encourages a careful philosophical contextualization of Blanchot's approach to the image. The two versions of the imaginary was written in reaction to Sartre's theory of the image, a theory itself inspired by Heidegger. The nature of the image in Blanchot is inherently linked to the materiality of death. Responding to Heidegger's comment on conscience schematism in his Kant-Buch, Kant on the Problem of Metaphysics, dating from the late 1920s, and Sartre's rereading of it in The Imaginary from 1940, which consider the image to be ontologically impoverished, Blanchot raised the image away from the conscience schema through a complete modification of the notion of resemblance. Blanchot's premise is that the image is doomed to an irreducible ambiguity. It has two versions, a French word which conflates the notion of both side and aspect, and a double relation to its model. Blanchot profoundly revised the traditional ontological approach to the image. Neither a copy nor the representation of a particular absent object, it is a presence of absence in general, the distancing of the object as such. Blanchot rejects the logical and temporal subordination of the image to a pre-existing model and instead establishes the entirety of the image in relation to the copy. It is not the object that comes first, but the image itself. Again, the usual completion of the image is writes, and this is a quotation you can see on the PowerPoint, that the image, according to the ordinary analysis, is secondary to the object. It is what follows. We see, then we imagine. After the object comes the image. After means to the thing must first take itself off, away, in order to be grasped, but this remove is not the simple displacement of the immovable object, which will nevertheless remain the same. Here the distance is in the art of the thing. The motif of doubleness, deprived of any real material reference, already prevalent in Blanchot's fictions, crops up here in a theoretical essay. The thing becomes an image, it becomes ungraspable, and remains the paradoxical appearance of what has already disappeared. An image is thus a mere resemblance without a reference, a double, which does not resemble any original. And that is the second quotation. Not only is the image of an object not the sense of this object, and not only is it of no avail in understanding the object, it tends to withdraw the object from understanding by maintaining it in the immobility of a resemblance which has nothing to resemble. This immobility of resemblance is also the ressassement or ceaseless iteration of fascination. The image is approached as temporal metamorphosis. It transforms a disruptive appearance into an endless and empty repetition, which determines the movement of fascination. In the annex, Blanchot succeeds in displacing the notion of resemblance thanks to another obscure, complex, and now famous comparison between the image and mortal remains. This modification of the Heideggerian notion of resemblance is mediated through the allusion to the cadaverous presence. Blanchot refers to the mortal remains as a means to express the specificity of the image and its power to fascinate. I quote, "The image does not at first glance resemble the corpse, but the cadaver's strangeness is perhaps also that of the image. The image of the corpse is thus given as the original definition of the image. This comparison seizes on the image as both a figurative and temporal disruption." And that is the next quotation. "The cadaverous resemblance haunts us," and I'm not going to read it entirely for the sake of time because we're late, but toward the end, "the idée fixe is not a point of departure, a position from which one could start off and progress. It's not a beginning, it begins again." The analogy explicitly destroyed the triad antis fascination and image, to which he adds the pair resemblance and recommencement. By forcing these two notions into relation, Blanchot reveals the image as a temporal and figural phenomenon that profoundly disturbs continuity and representation. Not of this world, and yet surviving in it. The corpse embodies a relationship between two antithetical loci, between here and nowhere. This irreducible tension accounts for the image's paradoxical presence in the forms of absence. There is also a point of obscurity in Blanchot's text, resulting from another unresolved tension, that between the corpse at the image and the image of the cadaver. The corpse becomes the essence of the image, for it starts to resemble itself. Blanchot is probably using the reflexive pronoun lui-même, itself. According to its original Latin meaning, ipse, it certainly gestured towards the collision of the cadaver's image with the image of classical art, the great images of classical art to which he will later refer. Yet, at the same time, if the cadaver gains a kind of sovereignty, it also starts to appear, far from being a disembodied idea. It is an excessive incarnation of material decay. And this is the other citation. "The image of the corpse is thus offered as the original meaning of images. The formless materiality seems to underlie the perfection of formal images, as if it were its necessary opposite and lining." A particular passage of Heidegger's Contour, analyzed by Jean-Luc Nancy in The Ground of the Image, sheds new light on some of the obscurities of Blanchot's text, and more particularly on his comparisons between the image and the mortal remains. In order to materialize the continuity between the image and the model, between the image as a vision and the image as a copy, Heidegger uses a quite surprising example, the photograph of a death mask. So this is quite a lengthy citation, but I want you to concentrate on the last paragraph. "It is possible to produce a copy photograph again from such a likeness, a photograph of a death mask, for example. The copy can only directly copy the likeness and thus reveals the image, the immediate look of the deceased himself. The photograph of the death mask as a copy of likeness is in itself an image, but this is only because it gives the image of the dead person, show how the dead person appears, or rather how it appeared." In this passage, Heidegger reintroduces the mimetic trilogy, model, copy, portrait, and around it the successive logic and temporal order that characterizes Kant's interpretation of the image, and which Blanchot in turn questions. Jean-Luc Nancy rightly stresses the importance of this example, which curiously enough, Heidegger offered quite inadvertently. The presence of the death mask indirectly recalls the Roman imago, the wax mold taken on the faces of the dead during Roman antiquity. The eruption of the imago within a philosophical meditation attempting to examine the conscience schema, the unity of the build, is indeed incongruous and uncanny. Nancy underlines that there is an empirical explanation for this choice of example, a material point. And you have the citation here. The empirical reason is the following. In 1926, the year in which Heidegger first taught the materials that will become the Kampbuch, a book by Ernst Benkart was published in Berlin under the title Das ewige Antlitz, Undying Faces. There is no great risk in the hypothesis that Heidegger was also struck by this work, whose renown would surely have made him aware of it, and that he would have seen it as a remarkable example of an image of an image. This is all the more likely in that photography, already for him an ordinary means of Abbildung, which he introduces into his text in the first example as an example of reproduction, before introducing the idea of a reproduction, of a first reproduction, is associated in this book with an Abbildung that is much less ordinary. And more archaic, both from an historical point of view and from a logical point of view, since it implies the immediate contact of the cast on the face. And you have an example of Das ewige Antlitz in its original edition with the unknown woman of the Seine. So, according to Nancy, Heidegger was thus prompted to use the image of the death mask by his reading of Ernst Benkart's Undying Faces. Heidegger paradoxically chooses this example of the death mask while at the same time obliterating its specificity. Undying Faces is considered as the first historical narrative of the Western practice of death mask in Germany. It fuels the vivid interest in death mask, which experienced revival during the aftermath of the First World War. This book presents photographs of the death mask from the collection of the Schiller National Museum of Marbach, 123 masks, many of well-known figures like Newton or Cornwell, Beethoven, Pascal, Hebel, or the famous Inconnu de la Seine. This book was an immediate success and was reprinted several times in subsequent. It is composed of a short text outlining the evolution of the death mask as both a ritual practice and an object of fascination. Then followed a note by Georg Kobler, the German sculptor who worked on the cenotaphs dedicated to Beethoven and Nietzsche, and a chronologically arranged collection of death masks that have been annotated. The first part of the text attempts a historical sketch that reveals much about Western attitudes towards death. It states that death masks, which Benkart interprets as a one-time prerogative of the privileged, were used as technical aids in the modeling of royal effigies and as byproducts of the political rites enacted as the death of kings. It was not until the 18th century that death masks asserted their existence as independent representation. Benkart argues that only at this time did the right become accessible to ordinary citizenship. After this shift, the death mask was progressively associated with the cult of political and artistic genius, especially in Germany, where the practice flourished. This pattern is reflected in the disposition of the plates at the end of the text. Their chronological classifications provide a material representation of the historical narrative Benkart construes. This perspective becomes particularly interesting when we consider the fact that Benkart closes his list of death masks precisely with the image of the Inconnu de la Seine, obviously endowing it with a special status. The plaster cast of the young woman, in addition to signaling a first phase of the practice, stands out in the collection. It is precisely within this historical account, with its own gaps and displacements, that Benkart's study deploys another aspect that is critical. The German historians never explicitly mention the intrinsic link between the practice of death mask and the broader traditions of casting processes, and it's been much studied by our historians regarding the imago and the voti. In his anxious urge to distinguish authentic death mask from simple cast, Benkart fails to outline the uncanny complicity between death and life that the practice of death mask invites or nourishes. It seems that in the two versions of the imaginary, Blanchot elucidates the specificity of Heidegger's example and casts light upon the oscillation between the death mask as an image and Blick and the image as an imago. That is to say, an effigy figuring a dead face. Blanchot's uncanny parallel between the image and the cadaverous is rendered legible through Heidegger's text. It belongs to a masked dialogue with Heidegger that aims at displacing his ontology of the image, while indirectly alluding to the visual archetype of the death mask. The death mask is as crucial to Blanchot's theorization of the image. Further evidence of this is furnished by the term it chooses to articulate its comparison between image and cadaver. Blanchot resorts on several occasions to the French word dépouille, a term applied not only to the cadaver, but also to a particular technique procedure of the molding practice. The pièce de dépouille is a segment of the cast corresponding to the molding of a prominent facial part, such as the nose, eyebrows, or cheekbones, and so facilitates the detachment of the cast. Inversely, the pièce de contre-dépouille corresponds to the imprint of cavities, such as the eyes. There is indeed, in the two versions of the imaginary, a continuous insistence on the neutrality, the deep fund of importance to which everything reverts, the unfathomable nowhere that envisages the same analogy. Again, in one of the earliest sections of the Infinite Conversation, entitled Vast as the Night, Blanchot, while analyzing Gaston Bachelard on a line by Baudelaire, suggests the conjunction between the realm of the imagination and the control world, as if pointing once more towards the archetype of the mask. I quote, "The image, which is each time the entire presence of this contour world that is perhaps the imaginary," end of quote. To return to my point of departure, the homage to a poetry haunted not only by the figure of the deceased, but also by the duality of representation, its charms and insufficiencies, appears all the more clearer when this tension between the imago and the build is borne in mind. The recurrence of the figure of and figures akin to death mask in philosophical essays of post-Heideggerian thought raises the questions of the use of images in theoretical discourse. Masks affirm themselves as heuristic devices and constellation of thought. The spectral quality of images in Blanchot's theoretical and literary space corresponds to the category of reflection, which according to Blanchot corresponds to art itself. I quote, "The category of art is linked to this possibility for objects to appear, to surrender, that is, to the pure and simple resemblance beyond which there is nothing but being." The mask reflectively designates this unfathomable nowhere from which the possibility of art arises. It unveils the intrinsic link between art and memory, like a nostalgic presence reminding us of our own ephemeral presence.
Je remercie Anne-Gaëlle Saliot de m'avoir généreusement invité à participer à cette rencontre dans laquelle je m'inscris de façon un peu particulière. Les pages que je vais vous lire sont une partie, un peu modifiée pour la circonstance, d'un texte écrit voilà tout juste 40 ans passés pour un volume que j'ai organisé, composé d'analyses de films consacrés au cinéma classique américain. En approchant sous le titre symbolique 2 films de genre, The Westerner, 1941, de William Wyler, et un film fantastique, The Mystery of the Wax Museum, 1933, de Michael Curtis, je cherchais à étendre et à confirmer les acquis théoriques de mon livre, L'analyse du film, qui regroupait pour l'essentiel des études publiées entre 1969 et 1979. Portant largement sur le cinéma d'Alfred Hitchcock, ces textes pouvaient sembler une simple application des concepts majeurs de la psychanalyse, alors qu'ils visaient plutôt à établir comment ces concepts et les films considérés participaient d'un régime global de symbolisation. Pour le dire en 2 mots, il s'agit du régime défini par Michel Foucault comme le dispositif de sexualité qui s'impose dans le glissement du XVIIIe au XIXe siècle avec le développement de la famille bourgeoise et nucléaire. Dispositif qui correspond à la réalité du romantisme, au sens large du terme, qui va bien au-delà du romantisme proprement historique. Dans cette perspective, la psychanalyse se trouve considérée comme participant de la même histoire que ce qu'elle permet d'éclairer, plutôt que comme une vérité transcendante et intemporelle. Pour illustrer mon intervention, j'ai choisi deux formules. D'abord, vous montrer d'emblée 1 minute de la copie restaurée du film, cela en muet, cela fait gagner du temps, juste pour vous donner une idée de sa tonalité. Ensuite, vous montrez les images, mais en noir et blanc, qui accompagnaient au plus près le déroulement de mon analyse lors de sa publication en 1980. Voici comment, dans Joseph Balsamo, le roman historique d'Alexandre Dumas, publié au beau milieu du XIXe siècle, est évoqué la nuit de noces du futur Louis XVI. Le déchaînement d'un orage a interdit au jeune marié de toucher sa jeune femme et elle lui confie la vision que le magicien Balsamo a fait apparaître à ses yeux au moment où elle a tout juste passé la frontière de la France. Écoutez, c'est impossible à décrire. C'était une machine, élevée au-dessus de la terre comme un échafaud, mais à cet échafaud s'adaptait comme les deux montants d'une échelle. Et entre ces deux montants glissait un couteau, un couperet, une hache. Je voyais cela, et, chose étrange, je voyais aussi ma tête au-dessous du couteau. Le couteau glissa entre les deux montants et sépara mon corps de ma tête, qui tomba et roula à terre. Voilà ce que j'ai vu, monsieur. Voilà ce que j'ai vu. Pure hallucination, madame, dit le dauphin. Je connais à peu près tous les instruments de supplice à l'aide desquels on donne la mort, et celui-là n'existe point. Dans l'imagination de l'Occident, Marie-Antoinette occupe la place de la reine morte, de la castration qui s'y symbolise, à travers l'image en miroir qui en saisit le sujet masculin, le sujet du discours, l'énonciateur. D'Alexandre Dumas au frère Goncourt, au XIXe siècle en France, son image frappe l'histoire et la fiction pour se retrouver comme tant d'autres, retravaillée dans la fantasmatique obsessionnelle du cinéma américain. Par exemple, ici, dans la fiction des musées de cire, où l'histoire depuis la fin du XVIIIe siècle se fige dans la reproduction ambiguë de ces figures, quelque part entre la sculpture, la photo, le masque mortuaire et le cinéma en relief. Chacun connaît, ne serait-ce qu'à travers le remake d'André de Toth, House of Wax, 1953, en 3D justement, chacun connaît l'histoire du musée de cire. L'histoire de ce sculpteur devenu fou après l'incendie criminel qui a détruit le rêve matérialisé de son obsession d'artiste et qui a fait de lui un infirme, impropre à toute création. Il est voué dès lors à la plus extraordinaire des reconversions maniaques. Ce qu'il ne peut plus engendrer de ses mains malhabiles, il le crée à partir de modèles vivants qu'il assassine et dont il ravit les corps à la morgue. Il les soumet ensuite à un traitement particulier pour reconstituer une par une les pièces de son ancien musée, dotées du supplément de vérité qu'elles doivent à leur capacité proprement stupéfiante d'imiter la vie. Dans son ancien musée, sur lequel le film commence, comme vous l'avez vu, sa Marie-Antoinette, son chef-d'œuvre, semble vraiment vivante. Le cinéma porte évidemment cette illusion à son comble, puisque la statue est incarnée par l'actrice du film, qui réveillera en lui le fantasme de l'objet perdu et permettra au récit de se nouer autour de cette impossible restitution. Dans le corps de Marie-Antoinette, quelque chose est toujours déjà perdu. Soit ce que le sujet peut y lire de sa propre perte, selon une position double d'idéalisation et de fétichisation, c'est-à-dire la castration saisie par ses deux côtés. Position que la vivante fixité de la statue porte à son point d'incandescence. On le voit dès les plans qui unissent, lors de l'inauguration de l'ancien musée, l'artiste et son objet, par un contre-champ illusoire à travers lesquels les regards ne se rencontrent pas le héros regarde la femme qui ne regarde qu'un hors-champ immatériel. Cela s'inscrit surtout au cours de l'incendie par un double déplacement selon un effet de miroir qui porte à son comble l'élaboration du fantasme. D'un côté, on voit le corps de Marie-Antoinette environné de flammes, sur lequel se concentre le désespoir d'Ivan Grégor. De l'autre, il y a deux figures qui entrent en composition avec la statue de la reine et le corps du sculpteur. Un homme actionnant une guillotine et une femme anonyme. Le feu qui s'étend provoque un double effet coordonné, souligné par l'imbrication et la succession des motifs. Il fait fondre le corps de la seconde sculpture, décèle doucement la tête de la femme qui chavire et saute 2 plans plus loin, comme sous l'effet d'une décollation. Le couperet de la guillotine ne semble ainsi trancher la tête de cette femme inconnue que pour figurer la décollation de Marie-Antoinette, dont le corps est à cet instant littéralement voilé de flammes. Il faut éviter de montrer la scène et en souligner ainsi à l'extrême la fonction de fantasme. Mais ce fantasme adressé au spectateur n'a de sens qu'à frapper dans le même temps le sujet qui en est le support dans la fiction, soit le sculpteur halluciné qui semble à son tour recevoir le couperet et finira par s'effondrer comme l'objet de son désir entre les flammes. La passion du sculpteur pour Marie-Antoinette est ainsi formée par l'image d'une représentation historique qui s'inscrit dans son corps pour y modeler son désir. La figure de cire qui soutient cette idéalisation d'objet, comme cette sublimation, est aussi un fétiche singulier dont le corps entier, comme l'est dans Psycho d'Alfred Hitchcock, le corps empaillé de la mère, se donne pour le signifiant phallique figuré dans la rigidité de la cire. Et cela parce que ce fétiche porte en lui la trace imaginaire d'une séparation, d'une section, d'un manque indélébile. Entre les créatures du musée de cire, Marie-Antoinette peut être érigée en objet idéal et régler la dérive fixe d'un délire parce que sa tête est toujours dans l'histoire réelle déjà tombée. Ainsi se trouve exhibée la structure sadique sous-jacente au redoublement narcissique par lequel l'homme, pour se penser, ne peut le faire qu'à travers l'image en miroir qu'il reçoit du corps de la femme, de ce qu'il y projette et qui lui en revient ou en trop ou en moins. C'est bien ce que le récit va produire à partir du retour d'Ivan Grégor qui reconstitue son musée de cire. Et cela en 2 temps que sépare le délai herméneutique nécessaire à la formation du suspense de la dilatation de la dynamique pulsionnelle. Premier temps, la rencontre. Quand il voit Charlotte Duncan, Ivan Grégor reconnaît en elle l'objet perdu, le seul qui manque encore à son musée de morts-vivants, qui ne peut vraiment vivre que par elle, puisqu'elle en est la métaphore absolue. Deuxième temps, l'agression. Dans le musée reconstitué, Charlotte s'avance, blanche, frêle, mouvante, au milieu des figures immobiles, venant au rendez-vous que lui a fixé Ivan Grégor. La scène produit 2 révélations. Le sculpteur n'est pas un infirme, puisqu'il se lève de sa chaise roulante sans plus s'aider de ses béquilles pour agresser la jeune femme. Mais le sculpteur est bien un infirme. En se débattant, Charlotte brise un masque de cire sous lequel apparaît un visage monstrueux. Cette révélation contradictoire insiste évidemment par son double jeu même sur la castration, en renchérissant sur l'effet de miroir formé autour de la décollation qui a été déplacée dans la scène de l'incendie. Le déplacement qui s'opère ici du bas vers le haut, des jambes à la tête du sculpteur, souligne l'assimilation symbolique qui permet, de l'homme à la femme, la constitution du fantasme par une identité de la blessure corporelle. Ils sont tous les deux frappés à la tête. Mais le déplacement antérieur vers le bas, qui est simulé, puisque Ivan Grégor marche, sert encore à lier entre elles, dans la relation réversible entre les corps de Marie-Antoinette et du sculpteur, 2 propositions freudiennes. La première souligne le déplacement de la sensation de la partie inférieure à la partie supérieure du corps. La seconde précise décapitation égale castration. Le couperet qui frappe le sculpteur aux jambes passe bien sous la robe de Marie-Antoinette. Enfin, la fiction de la cire parachève leur assimilation. Dans le temps du premier musée, un homme de chair aime une femme de cire. Dans le second, un étrange alliage de vie et de mort se figure, comme pour retrouver la perversion du temps perdu. Recouvrant le visage déformé de l'homme, il y a un masque de cire. Il a été sculpté d'on ne sait quelle main, sinon la sienne, qui ne le peut plus. La fiction se nourrit toujours de son corps même, c'est la logique de l'invraisemblable. Et c'est d'une mince pellicule de cire, d'une sorte de masque diffus et translucide, que le sculpteur s'apprête à recouvrir le visage et le corps de sa victime pour retrouver transfiguré inversement par sa mort même l'image corps de son objet idéalement restauré. C'est là ce que, bien sûr, la narration vient interdire. Le fiancé de la jeune femme, son ami et la police surviendront à l'instant fatal pour suspendre le meurtre et l'opération. Et par un renversement propre à tant de films qui accentue en la dénouant la circularité du récit, par un ultime effet de miroir entre le meurtrier et sa victime, le sculpteur, dans la lutte finale, tombera dans la cuve fumante de cire fondue qui devait recevoir le corps de Charlotte. Car ce film compte aussi l'histoire d'un autre couple et même de deux autres couples. Le premier est formé par Charlotte et Ralph Burton, l'un des collaborateurs d'Ivan Gregor, dont il ignore évidemment la manie criminelle. Le second est formé par l'ami de Charlotte, Florence, journaliste en mal de copie, et Jim, le rédacteur en chef du journal, où elle essaie d'imposer ses articles. Autant le premier couple obéit aux conventions pudiques de l'idylle, autant le second est réglé par un contrat d'agressivité ironique, tout aussi strictement codé. Les deux couples filent ainsi tout au long du récit un jeu de contrepoint déterminé par une option commune, la stabilisation du couple et le mariage qui en est la sanction. C'est même sur un plan de Florence et de Jim, toute résistance abolie, que le film se termine. On se demandera ce qui lie le couple fantastique formé par Ivan Gregor, Marie-Antoinette, Charlotte, à ces deux couples positifs qui semblent presque étrangers au récit, tellement ils sont fallaux en regard du fantasme qui leur donne. Mais ils y occupent une place substantielle, et surtout, l'un de ces termes, Charlotte, est commun aux deux ensembles. Bref, tous les éléments s'y nouent avec cet art si subtil du faux naturel qui fonde en vraisemblable l'irréalité du film classique. En fait, ces couples prétendument réalistes constituent la caution du premier, dans l'exacte mesure où ils soutiennent son émergence symbolique. Cela veut dire que la folie brute du fantasme se trouve comme justifiée, comme apaisée et métamorphosée par l'issue narrative dont elle fait l'objet, et que cet effet de résolution entretient un rapport d'identité décalé avec le drame qu'il sanctionne. L'effroi marqué dans le corps de la femme en est le signe. Il dessine, entre Ivan Gregor et Ralph Burton, le trajet vivace qui leur confère à l'un et l'autre Charlotte comme objet. Et ceci dans un cadre où s'installe de surcroît, on pourrait y insister, la logique de la rivalité oedipienne. Gregor est un vieillard, un maître, Ralph un jeune homme et son disciple. Il faut que Ralph reçoive de Gregor en s'y substituant une femme effrayée, une femme qui crie, marquée par le désir de mort. L'actrice Fay Wray ou la femme qui crie. Un an avant, elle crie dans The Most Dangerous Game, quelques mois plus tôt, dans King Kong, dont le tournage court parallèlement à celui du film de Curtis. Ralph Burton ne pourra se déprendre de ses désirs de mort que parce que sa fiancée en a été frappée par le fantasme halluciné d'un autre. Et c'est à cette condition que son désir se cristallise pour assumer dans le film comme ensemble la place du désir symbolisé. Comme si le film, par ce choc de représentation immergé dans des personnages, énonçait les conditions nécessaires au refoulement de la pulsion, après s'être, bien sûr, constitué à partir d'elle. Femme de chair contre femme de cire, femme vivante contre femme morte, mais marquée d'une peur qui va comme en écho jusqu'à constituer la condition de la réalité fictionnelle du couple. Et cet effet, de façon surprenante, se propage de femme à femme pour toucher par une sorte d'effet de contagion le second couple et servir de déclic à sa formation finale. Sur un mode à demi parodique tout au long de son enquête, Florence reçoit les effets indirects mais prégnants de cette même peur. Quand, par exemple, elle découvre un cercueil et y trouve des bouteilles, là où elle craignait de devoir affronter un mort. Quand elle commence surtout dans le musée à scruter les visages de cire et à reconnaître dans leur étrange fixité un trop de vérité, un plus que réel, qui est la mort même. Quand, enfin, pressentant le sort réservé à Charlotte, elle accourt, prévient Ralph, alerte la police. Si bien que c'est cette femme marquée par le rebond et le glissement du fantasme que Jim, personnage falot, finit par accepter, laissant tomber le masque pour lui avouer qu'il l'aime et veut l'épouser. Mais il ne peut le faire remarquablement qu'à partir du moment où Florence a découvert la vérité. Vérité de l'enquête, bien sûr, qui confirme ses qualités de journaliste, mais aussi, et c'est toute la force du film de pouvoir jouer d'une duplicité réelle, vérité nécessaire, symbolique, sur le désir et sur la mort, sur le désir de mort et ce qu'il détermine. Ce désir que Jim, tout comme Ralph, ne peut assumer en lui-même que parce qu'il l'a reconnu d'abord à travers le corps de la femme où s'en concentre la menace. C'est ainsi que des personnages plus ou moins secondaires finissent par sembler dotés d'une sorte de psychologie propre, à l'illusion de laquelle il ne faut pas se laisser prendre, mais dont il ne faut surtout pas éluder la fonction. En effet, ils représentent, comme le ou les héros de la fiction dont ils sont des effets nécessaires, le seul sujet réel du film, qui n'est autre que le film lui-même. Il n'y a ainsi dans le film classique que des emboîtements perpétuels, tout miroite et tout glisse pour se replier sans cesse autour d'un centre, même si ce centre bouge au point de paraître parfois extérieur à lui-même.
I have the distinct honor to be with Marie in conversation about Pascal Quignard's work and the question of the mask. So the question of the mask is absolutely central in contemporary French writer Pascal Quignard's work. And this event is the opportunity to explore it under a specific angle, which is Pascal Quignard's performances, and particularly La Rive dans le Noir, that we can translate in English, The Riverbank in the Dark. This show premiered at the Avignon Festival in 2016. The performance involves two wild birds, a diurnal raven and a nocturnal owl, and images of the Paleolithic caves. It's projected on stage, while Pascal Quignard reads his own text and plays on the piano pieces by Simon Piscene and Olivier Messiaen. In the middle of the show, Pascal Quignard, who is on stage without a costume or mask, brings an owl mask to actress Marie Vialle here with me today and puts it on her head. And the show thus begins by questioning both masks and the metamorphosis. So Marie, I would like to start with a very simple but essential question. Where did this idea of the mask in the riverbank in the dark come from?
Well, first, I would like to thank you, Stéphanie, for inviting me to this interview. I will do my best to answer in English, but please stop me if you don't understand what I'm saying. Now, to answer your question regarding the mask, it was Pascal's idea. He wanted an owl and a crow in the performance. In fact, originally, Pascal wanted to have not one mask, but two. An owl mask and a raven mask, and also two Paleolithic images. That of the Grand Duke in the Chauvet Cave and that of the Raven in the Lascaux Cave, which are both among the most famous prehistoric rock art sites in the world. He wanted to represent the shamanic bank among the ancient Siberians, namely that everything follows the movement of the sun, from day to night, from birth to death, from east to west, from stage right to stage left. The idea of the masks come within this set. Before I put on the owl mask, Pascal would take it, put the spotlight on it. It was first staged so that it would appear in Chinese shadow on stage left, and the image of the Chauvet Cave was superimposed on the Chinese shadow of the owl mask. In the first place, the mask was there to make an image appear because it is a dream career.
Okay, so yes, we can clearly see how, with what you just exposed now, the staging reflects the immemorial origin of the mask. When Pascal Quignard suggested this idea, did this staging feel natural to you? Did you immediately understand what Pascal Quignard wanted to achieve here?
Well, when I work with Pascal, actually, nothing surprises me. I always take his instructions literally. I always agree. I try them out. And then for him and for me, it's what happened on the set, what we don't control that decides this. In La Rive dans le Noir, for example, only the owl mask remained. The perfect symmetry of the two birds, the two masks, the two images was not working. The way it was originally done, the arrangements actually prevent a kind of spontaneity of acting. It was too heavy and it confused what was really happening on stage. So we thought we should hide the crow mask in one of the rooms. It was just us who knew that the crow mask was there. It was something just for us. But in fact, this detail really matters.
I agree. This is fantastic. So two masks, therefore, which also account for the double powers of the mask, because in it coexist the possibilities of simulations and concealment, of life and death, of ancestral past and present. So I would like us to look at some photos of the masks that was used in La Rive dans le Noir that I'm going to show on the PowerPoint I prepared, that maybe we can see here. I'm going to share my screen if my PowerPoint wants to appear. Hold on one second. Boop, boop, boop. Here, can you see my screen? Yes. So we have a mask that is here that represents your entire face here, Marie.
Yes.
Can you actually tell us who designed it? Were several versions made to see which one would be the most aesthetically pleasing?
Well, Cécile Kaczmarek made the masks. Cécile Kaczmarek's works on masks is known in the entertainment business. She specializes in mask, costume, and makeup in theater and cinema. She had already made a horse mask, a bird mask, and a cat mask for a previous play from Pascal, Triomphe du Temps. She creates masks that are sublime, dreamlike, and perfectly free in their form. There was no rehearsal. Once the masks were done, we used them as is.
Okay, so let's talk about the moment when in the middle of the show, Pascal Quignard is stage right with his old mask in his hands before putting it on your head. So before we comment on the affixing of the mask, let's quickly talk about what happens in the light. On the stage, we can see that the mask is bigger than your head. It takes up more space, as if the intention was also for the spectator to see this as if it were the middle of the night. It's as if you disappear under the mask, behind the mask, in the dark, since the white of the mask stands out in the darkness. The mask is then an image that rises up and asserts itself. It is both ostentation, concealment. Have you worked with Pascal Quignard specifically on this lighting and orientation of the mask towards the spectators?
Yes, the lights, the white of the day, the darkness of the night, the crow, a diurnal bird which is actually all black, the owl, a night bird which is all white, one that stands out from the other. It was all very important. The order of the gestures, all the movements, the color difference. This is a staging of a cosmic plan. What suits me perfectly in working with Pascal is that these rules we set for ourselves, these games we prepare, these orders that we install are more important than anything else, more important than the situations or dramas. I may be speaking for myself, but this is how I come to find myself very much alive when we work together, because our sets connect me to powers greater than me.
So I'm intrigued, Marie. You say cosmic plan. Can we say that with this owl mask, which is that of a nocturnal bird, with this daylight and nightlight game, there is a deliberate desire to activate the nocturnal to subtly evoke an ambivalent relationship to sleep or to dreams, or at the same time, a certain lucidity of fiction?
I think you can see what's going on better than I do, so I hope to be able to answer to your question. When I'm fully immersed in acting, one thing I'm sure of is that the theater that we invent with Pascal, the scenes that we play, are always on the nocturnal side, which means on the side of the chaos of the night, of dream, desires, crudely, the marvelous. To escape from the visible, from the known, to get away from the norm, from society's expectation, from the family, and to flee, to sink into a more exuberant self, closer to our desires, fears, and hidden dreams. It seems to me that this is what Pascal always writes about and what I try to interpret when I act.
We know that the moment Pascal Quignard raises the mask and covers your head with it, absolutely central to the play, and that many things are at stake during that moment. It seems then that now that your face is hidden, your identity changes because you no longer have the same appearance. It's as if you have permission to no longer look or act like yourself. At this precise moment, can you share with us your impressions as an actor? What does this imposition of the mask do to the body? How do you feel wearing this mask?
Well, it was a moment that I liked very much because it was the first time in the performance when Pascal and I really crossed paths. And when Pascal put the mask on my head, I felt that he did it very carefully, that he took care to transform me, and it's always beneficial for an actor to be dealt with within a nice day, to feel carried away. The sensation of the mask on my head amplifies this sort of internal bubble of an internal dark room, which must be very calm, very still, very peaceful, in order to be able to powerfully emit something without wavering. The mask had not been in character, but rather in my memory, it formed a kind of cocoon which shifted the direct hold that the spectators gaze out on me, thereby allowing me to be freer and more extravagant.
It's very interesting, Marie, what you said, that the mask had no binding character. Because precisely with what follows in the scene, we can see that the mask commands, that it engages the body in a transformation, causing it to move rhythmically. So the spectator actually feels like the mask is guiding you. We see your transformation, your movements change, your head turns abruptly. Suddenly it's as if the mask is taking power over you, as if you are becoming an owl or a bird. We can see an almost radical transformation in the gestures of your body. So my question here is like, what don't you think that the mask brings about a metamorphosis?
You're right. The mask imposition does bring about new movements. And as in music, where we go from a lento to an allegro, it allows a real break in the scene. It creates a fragmentation in the room. From the mask, we move on to something else without looking for an immediate connection with what happened before. The mask is something that above all involves an image, a metamorphosis, an appearance, a dream. I liked to explore the speed of the bird's movement, to disarticulate my body, to find different movements of the head, chest, neck, to imitate the bird's movement as lively and unexpected as they are, while calling out at the same time with cries that were actually a seagull and not an owl.
Okay, so would you say that the owl mask somehow forces you to be a bird?
It's funny because in fact, I realized, thanks to your question, that on the contrary, the mask removes the burden from me. It does not force me to be a bird. The mask is the bird. It is the mask that causes the spectator's gaze to see a bird. From my point of view, the bird is already there thanks to the mask. I no longer have to act it to make you believe that I am a bird. Then I can come and go. I can even do anything I want. In any case, I will always be a bird. And that is very precious for an actor, because the less you have to wear, the freer you are. And the freer and more available we are, the more the spectator can project himself. Children have this exactly ability not to care about the image they project. They say, I am an old man, and they are an old man, and we believe them. The mask allows this legitimacy to be something other than yourself that children have. And this is what allows for the metamorphosis to take place.
Okay, so I suggest we watch this moment of the show that we've been talking about for the audience. I have a small video here of a very specific moment. So here it is.
Qui est cette femme dont je tombe? Qui est cette femme dont je tombe? Quel est ce monde? Quel est ce sol? Quelle est cette région?
Pascal?
Oui.
Tu fais mon petit garçon?
D'accord.
Tu es mon petit garçon?
Oui.
Je suis ta grand-mère.
Oui.
Mon petit garçon, ton grand-père a été dévoré par des mouettes. Les tranchées, 14-18. Tout à coup, les hommes se sont repliés. 10 jours plus tard, quand ils sont revenus chercher mon époux, il ne restait presque plus rien du haut de son corps. Les mouettes.
C'est tellement étrange d'apprendre que son grand-père a été mangé par un oiseau.
Could you comment on this strange dialogue that follows the moment when Pascal Quignard puts the mask on your head?
Well, curiously, After the very formal pose of the mask, we have our very first dialogue with Pascal, which is both very deep and very light. Very deep in terms of revealing that the dead man was devoured by seagulls, but at the same time very light, because at that moment Pascal and I are inventing a game like children often do, without looking for any plausibility, any correctness, while being immersed in the pleasure of the dialogue, of the game proposed here. This back and forth, these different levels of acting are frequent in the play and allow Pascal and me to renew our relationship, to impact each other differently, to lead us both towards our respective metamorphoses.
I hear two things in what you say, Marie. The first is the impression that with the mask, all prohibitions are gone. Now is the time to admit what is shameful or shocking. So you said that the dialogue you have is light. Can indeed we say that with this mask on, words do not carry the same weight? Can we say that the mask has the power to deliver secrets?
Yes, absolutely. When the mask is on my head, I suggest to Pascal that we play the grandmother and little boy scene. And the grandmother reveals a family secret. The grandfather died in the trench of World War I and was devoured by seagulls. And the scene ends with the cries of the seagulls. It is this displacement of roles, of time, of space that the masks create, allowing for such a release, just as the displacement of the dream allows for the release of our desires and fears.
So following the idea of displacement, actually the second thing I heard is that you invented a game, like children do, you said. In fact, in this very dialogue, Pascal Quignard is the little boy. It's as if we are entering a space just for childhood where the mask has its own power. So does this game with the mask tame the space in this manner?
I tend to think that this sample game allows for that. It allows you to tame certain places that might be more stagnant. There, the mask highlight that we are acting, but with or without a mask on stage or in our lives, as soon as we act, as soon as we put a little space between ourselves and what happens to you, we tame reality.
Right, so the mask highlights this little dialogue between the grandmother and her little boy. But there is a second step where the bird's movement and cries take place. Can it be said at this point that you are embodying a bird, or can it be said that under the mask, speech takes on another state?
I will not be able to answer the question of the embodiment directly. Each spectator has a different reaction. With a little luck, some spectators forget about me and saw a bird, and others, for sure, still saw an actor trying to imitate a bird. As for me, I had a lot of fun making these sounds, but I was extremely focused on letting the right rhythm come, dissociating my body's movements and the cries, moving forward, counting the exact number of steps to stop at the good place, feel Pascal presence, and stay connected to him. I pictured the body of a bird, but my brain was in turmoil.
Yes, we can perfectly see here that the mask is not used to conceal. On the contrary, it reveals something. There is something which with the mask takes on a different form. It is both vocal impulse and a descent into primordial animality. It's as if another energy comes alive, I have to say, as if the spectator is in the midst of a mystery in front of a scene which is akin to metamorphosis or even shamanism. If we consider that shamanism is presented as a practice centered on mediation between human beings and spirits, and here between humans and bird spirits, I think about that because the shaman's costume is often made of skin and feathers. So for example, for Mircea Eliade, it symbolizes the transformation into the animal, often a bird, which personifies the possibility of flying, to embody the soul of the shaman who flies from another space, from one space to the other. So do you think, and we can see on the picture here, I hope you can see it on my PowerPoint, this picture is like very strong because, I mean, Marie, can you comment? Do you think we can talk about shamanism here?
Yes, absolutely. Shamanism and trance is something that fascinated us, Pascal and me. During our second performance together in Triomphe du Temps, Pascal taught me the tradition of the shaman and the bird stick. The bird stick is the object that stays behind so that the shaman's soul can come back to the actual world and settle. But real trance, withdrawal from the world due to fatigue or even extreme attention or perhaps brutal intuitions happens very rarely. It does not necessarily correspond to what the spectators see. We can give the idea, we can research it, we can stage it, but this form of drunkenness or altered state is something else. On the other hand, I sometimes think that the interpreter who really lets himself be affected by text and by those who wrote them, who send them out to those who watch him, addressing them from the bottom of his heart, giving himself the courage to do so when faced with both the living and departed. All this intermingling between worlds the interpreter does is itself a form of trance, of contact with the invisible, of blurred borders. When fear and anguish don't devour everything, then the journey on stage can be wonderful and really add something for those watching, which can be anything.
So, Marie, does this mask help fight this fear?
I don't think so, but I have too little experience acting with the mask to confirm this. I don't think, however, that fear is linked to the spectator's gaze, something the mask could protect us from. In my opinion, the mask above all helps create a relief. It helps to switch from one certain type of game to another.
So this, what you just said, reminds me of a quote that I had prepared actually from L'Origine de la Danse, and I'm going to show it here on my screen. And Pascal Quignard in L'Origine de la Danse writes, "I have become unable to differentiate between dance, mime, music, mask, tragedy." What do you think, Marie? Thinking of your acting practice, what do you think of this quote?
Well, I totally agree. I have a whole body. I don't see why I should cut myself into pieces, use only my head, my voice, or my feet. Distinctions are made to fit shows on our performance into boxes, but have nothing to do with the work we create. These are simply stories that differ in the intensity of the experience they provide.
I would like to conclude on a little paragraph Pascal Quignard sent me especially to contribute to our discussion today. So I'm going to read it. I show it here. Masks are called personae in Latin. These wooden masks that let the voice ring out farther per sound by hiding its face behind another face. They are megaphones where identity is lost. In French, they are the grammatical persons that replace us so dreadfully in our dialogues and speak in our place. In La Rive dans le Noir, I remained seated before the mask like a tragic Roman comedian contemplating the mask he is going to interpret. I behaved exactly like in the frescoes you see in Naples. The tragedian attempts to enter into the soul of the mask, of the god who is going to speak through him during his tragic trance. So Marie, do you want to react to those words to conclude our dialogue today?
Well, what Pascal wrote you is wonderful. This is such a beautiful definition of acting, to lose your identity, to lose your papers, to no longer belong to any community, not to have to defend anything about yourself anymore, to disappear.
Thank you very, very much, Marie. I know it's been like very challenging for you because you are rehearsing right now and in the middle of a rehearsal, but it was a distinct honor for me to be able to have this conversation with you and think about all these questions on the mask and performing and shamanism. So thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Dear teachers, dear colleagues, thank you very much for inviting us to this exciting online Unmasking Masks event. Speaking of masks, have you ever had the chance to walk into a mask sculptor studio? No, You didn't? Never. So this is what the studio of Master of Art and Creator of Theater My name is Claude Dessimond. I am a French PhD student at UPHF of Valenciennes in art under the direction of Professor Ramos Fercombe. And I'm also a student of Erhard Stiefel for about 12 years in a mask sculpture. On behalf of Erhard Stiefel and on behalf of his studio, I will present to you how we study masks, sculpting theater masks. The studio of the Master of Art and Creator of Stiefel is located in Paris, in a former gunpowder and munitions workshop built in 1874 in the Bois de Vincennes. This place, called the Cartoucherie, was occupied by the French army after the Second World War, then abandoned at the end of the 60s. At the beginning of the 70s, it was taken over by artists to become one of the first industrial wastelands in Europe to accommodate theaters, dance studios, but also visual artists such as, for example, the painter and sculptor Jean Dubuffet. Receiving audiences at the Théâtre du Soleil, directed by Ariane Nouchkine, the Cartoucherie has become, over 50 years, an essential place of French and also European theater culture. It is, therefore, in this artistic place conducive to creation, in a natural and calm environment, that Erhard Stiefel has established a unique place of artistic creation and research about theater masks. Erhard Stiefel was born in Zurich in 1940 and has lived in Paris since 1961. Trained in graphic design at the Zurich's Kunstgewerbeschule, he audited classes at the Beaux-Arts School in Paris and attended the very young school of the French movement pedagogue Jacques Lecoq. Associated with the Théâtre du Soleil since 1968 for the creation of masks, he has also participated in this field in the creation of 80 productions and collaborated with many artists such as the Argentine director Alfredo Arias, or in the United States, the actor Tim Robbins. Internationally known as a mask collector and an expert on Japanese masks, he became, in the year 2000, the first Master of Art in the field of performing arts appointed by the French Ministry of Culture and Communication. He acquired this title thanks to skills that were not handed down to him as is. He most often learned them on his own before developing them and patiently organizing them to the point of inventing a profession applied to the performing arts, creator of masks. Still in activity, and guarantor of his rare profession, which combines artistic creation with a very wide range of craft skills, and for which there are so far no diplomas or training places except for his studio. The Master of Art retains the will to develop knowledge in his field and pass it on his students. A living memory of the theater, which a bibliography as rich as it is varied. Erhard Stiefel is probably a very special case in performing arts, but perhaps also sculpture more broadly. So, what do we mean by theater masks? In France, this name appears clearly in two periods of history, according to French periodization, at the end of the modern era and in the contemporary era, and should be understood in several ways. As it appears for the first time in the middle of the 18th century, in Diderot and d'Alembert's French encyclopedia under the entry mask by Louis de Jaucourt, the term theater masks is mainly used to designate the masks worn by the actors in what the French researcher Florence Dupont called the theatron theatrum of antiquity, namely the Greek prosopon and the Roman persona. At the beginning of the 20th century, this name, used in various languages in Europe, evolved considerably. It still includes the Greek prosopon and the Roman persona, but historically extends to include the commedia dell'arte masks, used in the Renaissance, and the masks used in the theatrical production in the modern and contemporary eras. It also extends geographically to include masks used in form of extra-European performing arts perceived as, in quotes, theater, such as, for example, the No or the Kyogen practiced in Japan and the Topeng or wayang topeng practiced in Indonesia. In the most recent perception of these masks, a wide ethnocentrism seems evident. But we are aware that it would be a shame to reduce this definition to the question of the conscious or unconscious application of an interpretive grid specific to the 20th century in Europe to a whole variety of extra-European objects or historically older. Indeed, the word theater seems to have been associated with the word mask in order to indicate that these masks, which are artistic creations, but also technical objects, were linked, to use the words of the French technologist François Sigaud, by their form, their operation and function. Beyond their cultural particularities, these masks, which we should perhaps better call in English performing art masks, had enough in common to constitute a distinct set of masks, different from other set of masks to other types of masks, like, for example, the carnival masks. Since the beginning of my thesis, I have the feeling that the Western perception of masks must be revisited to produce new knowledge about them. Because indeed, as the American philosopher of science and epistemologist Thomas Kuhn proposed in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, when a series of consequent anomalies on a research object cannot be solved thanks to the established paradigm, this paradigm must be challenged and possibly changed. I will not have time to develop here the number of anomalies and received ideas that I have found in the academic field on the etymology and the complex history of the word mask and the definition of what a mask is as a technical object, but also around the material heritage relating to theater masks. However, I can say that we have found that we don't really know what a mask is. Indeed, we no longer really use masks in our social practices, and we also perhaps tend to reduce them maybe too quickly as ideas to theorize on them. This is why in Erhard Stiefel's studio, we tried to ask ourselves what a mask is as an artifact and sought to study these artifacts from a perception of masks from within. Here are, for example, two ideas we've developed to think about masks. In a recent publication, the Swiss philosopher Richard Vialle explained that masks are constituted of two useful sides that are simultaneously complementary and independent of each other and are connected by an edge. The inner face of the mask concerns the wearer and the outer face is environment. By dint of case studies and by proceeding by repetition, we think that each of these faces contains its own shape, its own mode of operation, and its own function relating to wearers and to their environments, including viewers. For the wearer, the first permanent level of function of a mask seems to be protection. As we said, obvious protection in profession or sport, but also protection to obvious protection as we all experience on a daily basis in this period of pandemic, in the medical field, in profession or sport, but also protection to approach the gods during rituals or protection of the social person in carnival and theater. We think that this first level of function of a mask is historically the subject of a misunderstanding, being almost unanimously and systematically understood in the Western culture as concealment. We have also learned from professional masks or masks used for sports, whose surfaces do not represent faces. And contrary to what is currently believed in our culture, especially between 2012 and 2000, based on modern and experimental on a corpus of 100 contemporary theater masks kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. To develop this protocol, we combined the knowledge we had as mask sculptors with the advice of the ethnologist Claude Dessimond, given in the first chapter of his book, The Way of the Masks, in which he imagined a method to apply systematically to the study of the masks of the Kwakutl and Haida of the west coast of Canada, to which he devoted his study. To complete this program, Claude Lévi-Strauss tells us, it is first of all important to consider the type of mask that has given us so many puzzles in order to bring together all the information we have about it. That is to say, everything we know about it, its aesthetic characteristics, its manufacturing technique, the use for which it is intended and the results expected from it. Finally, and the myths which account for its origin, its appearance and its condition of employment. Because it is only once this global file has been put together that it can be usefully compared to other files. The Decryption Protocol we've developed places the object considered as a document at the center of the research process. It includes several hundred criteria divided into 6 main sections. The researcher will first take stock of the condition of the mask, identify the manufacturing techniques, traces of tools, restorations, and uses on the inner face as well as the outer face. The researcher will describe the surface treatments, the air elements, the fastening systems. Archival work will also seek to determine the identities of the carriers, the authors, as well as any design studios, any collaboration between studios, and of course, the uses of this object. This search tool allows the insertion of media, audio comments, and all types of data relating to the history of the mask. Each mask description takes many hours and is made with as little manipulation as possible and with all the usual precautions. In Europe, theater masks were rarely kept. That's why masks very often lack certain elements, such as part of their hair, fastening systems, or paint, and are also deformed. This is, for example, the case of molded and painted leather masks from the European Renaissance. Faced with these degradations, it becomes difficult to understand these artifacts from the modern era, which were made to be used in an artistic or aesthetic way. Indeed, these plastic creations have never been studied from an archaeological, historical, technical, or aesthetic point of view. This is why we have drawn up an inventory of this type of mask. And that's why we're currently working with Erhard Stiefel on a method to reconstruct them. This is not unprecedented for the sculptor, who participated in the 90s in an experimental archaeology project to reconstruct masks at the Tokyo National Research Institute of Cultural Properties as part of the work of the Gigaku of the art historian Kyotaro Nishikawa. We use the results of this experiment. We are only at the beginning of these reconstructions, but the first results that we maybe are going to show you are very exciting. They allow us to finally reflect on these masks nourished by all this rich experience of reconstruction in front of complete images, which seems fundamental to us as mask sculptors. This research and this work are now at the Art of Erhard Stiefel studio and only ask to be deepened. We are indeed aware that studying the shapes of masks is not enough. The results of this work represent a third of the entire work. We would like to examine and describe later the relationship of masks to their wearer, thanks to experiments carried out on stage with actors, but also to describe the public's perception through, among other things, questionnaires. The scientific ambition of this work is clearly defined in the subtitle of my thesis, From the Creation Studio to the Research Laboratory. If we consider Erhard Stiefel as someone dedicated to passing down knowledge, it is indeed like seeking to bring into existence the studio laboratory which he has always wanted to create on the basis of his deep practical experience and of the 4,000 unpublished documents that it contains, including hundreds of masks. As a unique documentation and research center on masks used in the theater and in various performing arts around the world. The existence of this center could give rise to numerous publications, communications, exhibitions, and of course, artistic creations. Such a structure would probably be attractive to French and international researchers and artists. It could also motivate students who would like to develop research on masks used at different periods of theater history, but also to study more generally the cultural history of masks in Europe, the possible inclusion of masks in the general history of art, or philosophically questioning this object used as a communication tool at each period of human history. To conclude, I would like to say that revisiting the question of masks in theater history, and why not, masks in general, from in-depth practical knowledge, opens, in our opinion, and as we mentioned above, a considerable field of possible collaborations in many disciplines of the humanities and social sciences. Erhard Stiefel likes to remind his students that masks are among the greatest creations of human beings. The interest in updating the history in the theater and in a scientific framework, but also in designing tools for describing their forms, their operations and functions in the scientific field seems to us to find all its meaning in the hypothesis that we will put forward during our thesis, which says that masks, when they represent faces, were created to provoke in the different social groups which used them a fundamental intellectual work on their condition and for their survival. In our opinion, making people think could be the main function of masks for the viewers. Ultimately, what we might like to patiently highlight in the very long term is the density and complexity of this intellectual work carried out by humans on themselves and on their environment through the use of masks. By studying and using concrete examples of masks and continuing to develop mask studies as a possible field of research. Thank you very much for listening to me. The Master of Art, Erhard Stiefel, and I will be very happy to answer your possible question if you have some.
Thank you very much, Claude Dessimond, for this fascinating presentation, and to all of the speakers. We have approximately a half hour for questions, and I'd like to encourage the audience to submit questions. But first, I'd like to ask the panelists if they would like to open up the conversation. I have things that I would like to ask myself, but I'll give a chance for our speakers to interact. So perhaps I'll start by a general question that I think touches on what a number of presentations have talked about. I see masks from those conversations as an image characterized by its materiality and materiality in relation to death. So the oil mask, the melting mask, the melting wax mask are all sort of very material and striking images. And obviously what Claude Dessimond has just presented also speaks to that. Several of our speakers, in particular Professor Saliot and Professor Boulard, have underlined the doubleness of the mask, its double function, the image as vision, the image as copy, the function of concealment, or the function of simulation. And there's a contrast that is particularly striking to me between the connection of the mask to death, the morbid function of the image, which Professor Saliot has evoked, and the activating powers of the mask, the metamorphosis that, for instance, Vialle was describing, or the activating function between the mask and the relationship between both the actress and Pascal Quignard, or for the spectator, him or herself. And I guess my question would be, and anyone really feel free to answer, do you think that specifically it's the materiality or the physicality, or perhaps to use Heideggerian terminology, since we talked about Heidegger, the objectivity of the mask that allows for the metamorphosis, for the activating powers. And perhaps a smaller part of the question directed to Claude Dessimond and Erhard Stiefel. Perhaps I'd be interested to know a bit more about the choice of material in mask making and the function of the material. Has there been specific significations or meaning associated with a specific choice of material? So yeah, this is it.
This is a very good question. I think that Claude or Raymond wanted to say something, maybe?
On peut dire que, par exemple, à propos de la métamorphose, dans nos échanges avec Erhard Stiefel depuis un peu plus d'une dizaine d'années, c'est un mot qu'on avait tendance à utiliser et qu'on n'utilise plus parce que c'est une illusion, quand même. En tout cas, au théâtre, ça nous l'enseigne. C'est une illusion et c'est un visage artificiel, un masque. Et c'est une illusion et cette métamorphose, elle est artificielle. Donc, c'est pas tout à fait une métamorphose. C'est-à-dire nous on parle d'illusion.
So what I can say is that in terms of metamorphosis, in our discussions for the last 10 years or so with Erhard Stiefel, this is a word that we used to use and a word that we no longer use because it's an illusion. At least in the case of theater, mask is an artificial thing. And so metamorphosis in that sense is illusion. It's a face that is an illusion.
Et donc, je peux peut-être juste poursuivre une seconde en disant qu'effectivement, c'est cette illusion qu'on essaie de comprendre. C'est le mécanisme de cette illusion, le fonctionnement particulier de cet objet, la fonction particulière de ces objets, effectivement, et toutes ces nuances qu'il y a dans les différentes fonctions, différents fonctionnements, et qui se répercutent dans différentes formes, évidemment, les usages.
So this is the illusion that we're trying to understand in our work. Its mechanisms, its functions, and what are the specific functions of this object? We're trying to understand the nuances of the functions of these different objects.
Par exemple, dans l'étude des objets techniques, pour terminer avec... Pour essayer d'être complet dans ma réponse, François Sibaud explique très bien qu'on a tendance, quand on observe un objet, peu importe lequel, un couteau, une fourchette, on a tendance à confondre le fonctionnement et la fonction. Et que ça, c'est vraiment quelque chose à étudier. On a tendance à appeler des fonctions, en fait, des éléments qui sont de l'ordre du fonctionnement des masses. Je crois que je me suis rendu compte de ça à force d'étudier. Et donc, par exemple, là, c'est intéressant de voir effectivement dissocier ce qui est de l'ordre du fonctionnement de l'ordre de la fonction. Et quand on s'aperçoit qu'en fait, on prend le fonctionnement pour la fonction, on la revisite, on la redécouvre. Et François Sibaud disait pour ça, il avait un exemple qui était un couteau ne sert pas à couper, il sert en coupant. Et j'ai toujours beaucoup aimé cette phrase, je l'ai gardée comme repère. Le couteau sert à découper la viande ou à manger, enfin, à des tas d'autres choses, mais il sert en coupant. C'est son fonctionnement, la découpe, à travers le geste. Je me suis rendu compte que pour les masques, très souvent, dans le monde académique, les chercheurs, justement, faisaient ces confusions parce que chacun essayait un petit peu de donner sa propre définition avec ce qu'il croit avoir compris, ce qu'il pense avoir compris. Et qu'il n'y avait pas vraiment une étude, de fait. C'est pour ça qu'on a tenté on cherche à la faire.
So, for example, if we take an example of specific objects that we study, François Sibaud said that often there's a tendency to confuse in looking at an object, whether it's a knife or a fork, its function and the way that it functions. And this is something that I've realized through my years of study. For instance, if you take a knife, the knife does not serve to cut, it serves by cutting. That's its function that takes place through a gesture. And it seems, I've realized that in the academic world, frequently with masks, there's a tendency to confuse this. People bring their own understanding of the mask, and there's no real study of this difference between function and way of functioning. And so that's why we've started to do the work that we're trying to do.
Yes, of course, I completely concur with you, Chloé, that what's the specificity of the mask is that it's materiality, what philosophers might have called an indexical image. It's a form of imprint, which has specificities. I mean, I do not, but I see the point of that what was being made by Claude, that there's not been a proper study made on the uses of the mask, the real uses of the mask, an exhaustive one. But I'm also wondering if that would be possible, because it seems like an encyclopedic, extreme kind of work, but that's simply because of the plethoric manifestations of mask, you know. But I agree, and I was really, I mean, it took me an entire book to write only about one mask, and the way it's been treated and the way it resurfaced, and so yeah. So I would be curious to know how you conceive of such an enterprise, such a huge one. That's a question for you, Claude.
Je peux répondre maintenant. C'est déjà 12 ans de compagnonnage avec Erhard Stiefel à plein temps. C'est déjà long, ça. Et donc, c'est 50 ans, 60 ans d'expérience professionnelle au plus haut niveau, d'expérience même assez, pour Erhard Stiefel, assez exceptionnelle même à travers les différentes formes de spectacle dans le monde. Rencontre évidemment de masques, mais aussi de danseurs, d'acteurs. Le Théâtre du Soleil est un centre quand même qui a accueilli, qui est connu historiquement pour avoir accueilli, permis à tout un tas de cultures et de formes de spectacles dans le monde d'exister, où les acteurs les ont rencontrés, les gens du Théâtre du Soleil les ont rencontrés. Ça, c'est une chose. Et ensuite, ces 12 ans, j'ai commencé ma thèse il y a 10 ans et je n'ai pas fini. Parce que j'ai été confronté à un mur. Et si vous voulez, les anomalies que j'ai repérées, je les ai repérées parce que justement, je pratiquais. Si je n'avais pas pratiqué, je ne les aurais pas repérées. Je les ai repérées et j'ai le courage, entre guillemets, je ne sais pas si j'ai le courage, mais en tout cas, j'ai l'énergie pour essayer de le résoudre, parce que justement, la pratique m'aide, c'est-à-dire me stimule, m'aide, me nourrit, et voilà, je dirais ça, mais j'ai l'intention de travailler très longtemps sur ce sujet.
This is remarkable, I think.
Je vais traduire. Well, it's been 12 years of full-time work with Erhard Stiefel in my case, and then in Erhard Stiefel's case, it's 50 or 60 years of professional experience at the highest levels. And in Stiefel's case, it's exceptional experiences with performances and shows all over the world, encounters with masks and also actors. The Théâtre du Soleil is known as a center that comes over the world, and that therefore give the opportunity to actors to encounter these cultures. And then for me, it's been 12 years. I started my thesis 12 years ago, my PhD, and I still haven't finished because I came up against this wall, this missing information. And I have, perhaps I won't call it the courage, but the energy to continue working to resolve it, because the practice that we have inspires me and feeds me. And I continue to work a very long time on this. I intend to work a very long time on this project.
This is remarkable. And I have a question for Raymond, in fact, because you were talking about the wax museum and Marie Antoinette, but I came across when I was researching my own mask about a text by a Viennese art historian from the early 20th century called Julius Schlosser, who was studying wax mask, wax imprints, and considered them as being at the very origin of the art of the portrait. Like doing a complete reconstruction of the origin of representation through the use of wax, which I think is fascinating. But I would be curious to hear you a bit more about maybe the specific relations to wax as a material, as a medium, and cinema. And what are the correspondences you see? Raymond.
It's not very easy to answer that.
No.
There is, I don't see any specific correlation between film and wax. I mean, except in this wonderful film I try to speak about. But one thing which strikes me seeing the atelier of the wax sculpture is to insist on the way film has been entrusted in itself by mask, further than the film I have tried to illustrate. Okay, there is this famous Les yeux sans visage de Franju, but I think about free films, for example, which in completely varied directions insist on this possibility of mask for film, because the actor is a mask in himself, in a way. Take all the silent film and even talking one about Zorro, for example, was his black mask. Think about Le Masque de Fer, which is the twin brother of Louis XIV, who has been buried in prison and who had a mask, an iron mask, was hiding his face so that he would never be seen as the man he was. Or in this wonderful film, Le Plaisir from Max Ophuls, when you have this moment, this old man, who we don't know he's old at the beginning, who is dancing like a crazy one, and suddenly he faints and falls, and people go to help him, and here is the mask. He has the white mask, beautiful mask he has on his face. And he's just an old man under the mask, you know. And I think there would be an whole work in a way for film to work about the different examples of using mask. And I just thought right now to those three films, but I mean, I suppose there are many, many other films, and this could be an interesting study.
Yes, of course, I think that for sure. But about the wax museums and there is I mean, it's become quite famous in film studies, and I know you know about it, Raymond. There is this historian who has Vanessa Schwartz, who has claimed that there is a concomitancy between the use of wax museum and the development of this kind of attraction to the birth of cinema. She's making a link. She's also making a link to the morgue. But in a way, the film you have chosen today really, is a perfect example for our argument. So I know you might have some criticism or distances, but
well, there is even in the film one or two moments on which I have not insisted, in which we see the fabrication of some masks, some wax effigies. For the sort of atelier in which the assistant of the crazy artist are working. So I've not insisted on that because I was trying to follow another track, but there is a sort of little documentary part, if we can say, inside of the fiction, which insists on the fabrication of the mask. And you are completely right to quote Vanessa Schwartz. Her book is very interesting in that way because she insists in the way film and wax, the development of film and wax museum at the end of the 19th century have been historically concomitant, I mean, and pertain to the same historical and epistemological configuration.
Regime of visibility and the desire to watch and to see, and the scopophilia. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I mean, my favorite film on mask is definitely Eyes Without a Face by Frangé.
Yeah, for sure.
That's because of surrealism, but that's, I think, unsurpassable.
I think also to a film which is in between, I would say, about mask. The Dr. Mabuse, the Fritz Lang film. Yeah. You have a wonderful sequence at the beginning in which he is mimicking in front of us the different identities he's able to get through a series of photographies. And it's not exactly masked, but his way of treating his own face to be each time a different person. So it looks like he's building a sort of artificial mask out of his own person.
And I was also thinking about the ways in which certain filmmakers are using the term mask to talk about their own images and the process of making their own images. So I just, I just think it's very interesting in terms of the medium. Of course, that works with analogical cinema, not the numeric, not the digital one. But there's also something I think about the materiality that Chloé asked about that might also intersect with just how filmmakers are even talking about their use of images. Yeah.
No,
I think of Martin Arnold who's talking about mask when he's making images, I've been told.
Now, thinking about that, I'm just surprised that I don't know any general study about mask in cinema.
No.
This would be interesting. I mean, really.
This would be fascinating. Another very long PhD in prospect, but yeah.
Another one.
And I also have a question for Marie and Stéphanie, because I mean, you've talked about, I mean, quite in detail about the experience of wearing a mask and that it can be a form of not dissimulation and concealment, but rather, in fact, a way to liberate some forces in your acting. And I was just curious how it felt to wear that mask and I was shocked by the similarities between Pascal Quignard's face and the mask. I don't know if you've noticed, but he looks like the old mask. But how was it to play with the mask? I mean, is it something that, I mean, because that must be very different than just playing with a naked face, if I must say. Yeah.
Can I answer in French, because
of course we have Nicola who's kindly helping us with the translation.
Moi, j'ai vraiment une expérience du masque. Je suis très admirative de tout ce que j'ai entendu, mais c'est la seule et unique fois où j'ai joué avec un masque. Donc, j'ai vraiment une toute petite expérience. Mais néanmoins, j'ai le souvenir de quelque chose de très doux. Mais aussi parce que, en fait, je ne peux pas distinguer, je ne peux pas juste parler du masque comme ça. Je parle du masque dans mon rapport avec Pascal. C'est-à-dire, c'est ce que je disais tout à l'heure, c'est la manière dont il me le posait, dont il me regardait, dont il me soutenait aussi, qui est lié au port du masque. Et donc, j'ai le souvenir de quelque chose de très doux. Et au fond, en fait, ça comment dire, c'est pas pour moi, c'est pas un jeu qui est radicalement différent. Ça intensifie quelque chose, ça intensifie peut-être comment dire, ça donne plus de force interne. Mais je sais pas, en fait, sinon, c'est une histoire de présence, c'est juste d'être là et de jouer. Donc, au fond, pour moi, c'est similaire.
D'accord. I think we're waiting for Nicola to translate.
Oui, si
je peux juste traduire, pardon.
Yeah.
My experience, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Experience. Yeah, I very much admire everything that I've heard so far, but I have to say that my mask is relatively limited because this time that I use a mask, my memory of this experience is of something very gentle, and I can't really separate the mask from my relationship with Pascal. For instance, the way he would put the mask on me, the way he would look at me. So it's a very gentle memory. Beyond that, I have to say that it's not a radically different experience in terms of acting. I could say that the mask intensifies something. It gives you more internal strength, but ultimately it's just a question of presence in acting. And that's something very similar, whether or not you have a mask.
Yeah, I wanted to add something about what Anne-Gaëlle mentioned about this fact that the mask looks like Pascal, and it is an interesting note, Anne-Gaëlle, because the writer is the owl, and in connection with the night, the darkness, and the owl also. Pascal Quignard writes a lot about it, and as Marie mentioned, she is doing seagull cries during the play, not owl cries, which is also like something to comment on. But it's a very interesting use of the mask in this play.
I have, in fact, a question that might connect Erhard and Claude and Marie and Stéphanie, because when I read Pascal Quignard, Origine de la danse, The Origin of Dance, which I really like, because I'm very interested in Butoh, but I was quite, I mean, if I remember well, because I've read it ages ago, but there is an insistence on performing arts involving mask in his approach to dance. And especially the no, you know, is kind of decentering the approach to dance. It's not like he's not approaching it from a Western perspective, but really tries to connect it with other forms of Japanese performing arts. And so I was wondering if you see maybe there would be a connection between his use of mask in the play you participated, Marie, and this wider interest he has. And if maybe Claude and Erhard had the opportunity to meet with Pascal Quignard, maybe? Don't know if that could be a cooperation or collaboration. No?
Never.
No, never? That would be great. I mean, because he's very interested in Butoh, you know, in no Butoh. He has himself, I think, a great interest in Japanese mask, of which you are apparently an expert as well. So.
Yes, I mean, I can answer a little bit about that. In the No theater, the actor has to appropriate the mask. There is a ceremonial, and the actor doesn't consider in general that he puts a mask on, but he's going himself physically and spiritually inside this mask. So there is something about a ritual in the No theater. At the same time, there is always the risk. Ariane Mnouchkine mentioned that a mask actor, there is always the risk that the actor can remain without voice, right? Which is what Pascal Quignard was saying, like the mask should be something to carry the voice. And so it's a traversée. I don't know how I would say that in English. It's a traversée, and there is a type of ritual and order that you need to overcome and go beyond, because the actor can experiment some anxiety. It's a different like body that moves and is in transformation. So with Pascal Quignard, yes, there is this fascination for the No theater that is also all the emotions and the very specific atmosphere that is in the No theater, where there is simplicity, movement, some kind of raffinement, but also what is important for Pascal also is the I would say the different worlds that it connects between life and death and resurrection, especially something that interests you very much, Anne-Gaëlle, in the Japanese culture and the connection with World War II and the Hiroshima bomb that Pascal Quignard explores and mentioned. So I don't know if that say something about your question.
No, it is perfect. Chloé, I was wondering where we are standing with time.
Yes, I was going to say that we might have a couple of minutes for maybe a last question or last comment, but we should probably wrap up to leave everyone time to take a little break before the afternoon, or I guess the evening starts.
Maybe we can show you a mask.
That would be great, please.
That would be great.
A great way to finish the panel on, absolutely.
We have Erhard Stiefel, maybe can show you a very old mask. We're studying a mask from the Renaissance, like I said, from the 16th century to 18th century. And we were found only 10 in the world of this type of leather mask.
Oh.
So, you know, we have a problem with we have to find artifacts to work on them, and there are not a lot. And Erhard has in his collection a very rare leather molded and painted leather mask. And tu veux présenter cet objet? Ça fait bien pour finir, je pensais, non?
Oui, that's great. I mean, c'est super parce que c'est un vrai cadeau, ça. C'est un gift.
Je cherche ce que c'est un masque théâtre depuis je ne sais pas combien d'années, donc autour de 60 ans, oui. Et finalement là, je suis toujours en train de faire des recherches pour savoir ce que c'est un masque théâtre. Donc je peux parler que de ça, masque de théâtre. Et je peux parler de cet objet. Qui est ça? Donc, vous voyez, donc, c'est un masque original de l'époque. Alors on peut peut-être même le voir assez proche. Voilà.
Parfait.
Et au monde, il n'a que 10 exemplaires dans cet état-là, qui ont survécu tout le temps. Alors, mon dada est fait en ce moment que ça, je fais des recherches, essaie de reconstituer complètement ça. Et donc là, voilà, il y a quelques étapes jusqu'à la finale, ça devrait être ça. Ça, c'est déjà une approche de masque comme il était au début. Donc, c'est ça qui m'intéresse en ce moment beaucoup aussi. Toujours pour comprendre le masque, qui est toujours, pour moi encore, il y a plein de choses inconnues. Je pense, je maîtrise pas tout. Voilà.
J'ajouterais une phrase, si Nicolas me permet, ou après. Oui.
Je vais traduire peut-être.
S'il vous plaît, merci.
So what I'm looking for, what I've always been looking for, is what a theater mask is. This is what I've been researching for so many years, 60 years, as Claude was saying, and that's still what I'm looking for. So I can only talk about that. What is a theater mask? This, what I have here, is an original mask of which there are only 10 in the world that are in this state, that have survived time. And my obsession at the moment is to recreate, to reconstitute a mask like this one. And this, what I've showed you, the two pieces, is the final stage of where this mask could go. I'm still trying to understand masks. There are still things that remain unknown for me, but this is what I'm working toward.
Et j'ajouterai une dernière phrase, si vous me permettez, c'est que il n'y a aucune ligne écrite dans le monde académique sur ce type d'objet, qui sont des masques européens et qui sont des masques faits peut-être à Paris. Voilà.
And I just want to add one last sentence, which is that there's not a single line written in the academic world about this kind of object, which is a European mask, very possibly constructed in Paris.
Thank you all of you for being here, and again, thank you for the translation. I think this went very well streamlined, and I think that the next panel should start in exactly a half hour. So looking forward to the rest of those conversations and continuing the day with all of you. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful discussion.